Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Michael Turner had always been seen as a strong, dedicated man, someone who rarely let life's turbulence get to him. For nearly 4 decades, he woke up early, dressed with the same discipline every day, and poured his best energy into the company that had become almost like a second home. He was about to reap the rewards of all that loyalty. The long dream of retirement was just a few months away. The future seemed clear, almost predictable. But in a single moment, that entire sense of stability was swallowed by a cruel doubt. That afternoon, he decided to stop by a café near the office. Nothing special, nothing eye-catching, just a place he often visited to ease the weight of another long workday. But as he walked through the door, something made the air feel heavier. His eyes locked onto a scene that froze him in place. Sitting there with a cup of coffee was Margaret, his wife, accompanied by Eric Collins, the young general manager and son of the company owner. The age difference between them was striking. Margaret was 60, while Eric still carried the unmistakable look of youth. They were chatting easily, their expressions showing a level of closeness that felt off. Her smile, followed by a comment from him, seemed more intimate than any ordinary work conversation. Michael's heart started racing, each beat echoing like a hammer inside his chest. He blinked several times, almost hoping the image would shift, that it was just a coincidence or an illusion. But there was no mistake. It was really his wife and the owner's son. Questions began piling up in his mind. What were they doing together? Why here, far from the company's eyes? Why so much laughter, so much ease between them? Michael's throat went dry. His first instinct was to stand up, demand answers right then, slam his hand on the table and force the truth out of them. But reality hit him like a sudden break. His retirement was about to be confirmed. 38 years of work couldn't be thrown away over an impulsive move. Eric wasn't just his boss, he was the heir to the entire company. Any rash action could cost him his job, his reputation, even the dignity he'd worked so hard to build. The dilemma was crushing: swallow what he saw, or risk everything. He stayed put, pretending nothing was wrong, trying to steady his breathing. His mind was at war, on one side, anger eating at him at the thought of his wife with another man, on the other, fear of losing everything he'd built. Every gesture between Margaret and Eric in that café deepened the pain. When she slightly tilted her head toward him, as if hanging on his every word, Michael felt a piece of his trust shatter into 1,000 pieces. He couldn't remember ever doubting her. Margaret had always been a loyal partner, there for both victories and defeats. What had changed? Why, at this point in life, would something threaten a marriage built with so much effort? Memories of trips, family lunches, and birthdays mixed with the café scene, creating a cruel contrast between the woman he thought he knew and the one sitting with Eric. Michael stayed just long enough to confirm what he saw. He couldn't bring himself to walk over to their table. Something inside warned him it wasn't the right moment. It was as if his own life experience was holding him back. So he quietly left, carrying a storm inside. Every detail he witnessed replayed in his mind like a looping film: Margaret's laugh, Eric's youthful gaze, their closeness. As he walked home, the feeling of betrayal blended with helplessness. For the first time in years, Michael felt like he wasn't in control of his own life. Everything seemed to be slowly and painfully falling apart, and he didn't even know how to react. That simple café, which had always just been a brief pause in his day, had now become the stage for a scene threatening to destroy decades of trust, love, and security. Michael arrived home with a heavy heart, haunted by the image replaying in his mind like torture. He tried to keep it together, waited for dinner to start, but the words slipped out anyway. He looked at Margaret and said he'd stopped by the café. Her reaction was instant, a barely noticeable flinch, but enough for him to catch it. He described what he'd seen: her sitting across from a cup, laughing, leaning toward Eric Collins. Each detail he shared felt like a knife in his own skin, but he needed to hear her side. Margaret, with a serious expression, repeated that it didn't make sense, that she'd never meet with her boss, that maybe he'd gotten it wrong. Her tone wasn't nervous, it was firm, as if she truly believed what she was saying. She said it more than once, "It wasn't me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael studied every move she made, every glance, searching for any sign of deception. She, in turn, looked him straight in the eye, not flinching, as if she felt wronged by the accusation. He remembered their entire history, years of closeness, shared struggles, mutual support. Why now, after all this time, would something like this happen? Why now, right before his retirement, when they should be dreaming together about this new chapter? Michael tried to keep his voice calm, but it came out harsher than he intended. He said he wasn't crazy, that he was sure of what he'd seen. Margaret reacted with a mix of surprise and indignation, asking if he really thought she'd be capable of something like that. Her conviction shook him, and for a few seconds, Michael almost doubted his own eyes. Almost. Because the image remained as clear as when he first saw it. Dinner was forgotten. Margaret stood up, paced the room, saying she'd never give him a reason to suspect her. She brought up trips, moments of unity, stories that felt as solid as a foundation. Michael listened, but inside, the wound was already open. Her words made sense, but his heart was at war with his mind. Part of him begged to believe her, while another part screamed that something was wrong. When he lay down that night, the bedroom, once a sanctuary, became a silent battlefield. Margaret fell asleep quickly, maybe tired from the argument, maybe unaware of the weight crushing him. Michael stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, reliving every moment from the café. The trust of a lifetime now seemed cracked, each memory widening the split a little more. He started questioning if he'd been fair. Could it have just been a misunderstanding? Was it the angle, the distance, the rush that created an illusion? But his mind kept insisting, the smile was hers, the way she rested her hand on the table was hers, the knowing look between them was unmistakable. Margaret could deny it all she wanted, but deep down, something told him what he saw was real. That doubt didn't let him rest. That night, Michael tossed and turned, weighed down by a dilemma with no answer. Did he believe the woman he'd shared his whole life with, or did he trust his own eyes, which had never failed him before? Between those two paths, his anxiety began to shift into something deeper, the need to find proof, to uncover an answer that would free his mind from the prison it had fallen into. Michael woke up the next morning feeling like last night's conversation had solved nothing. If anything, the uncertainty felt stronger than ever. He watched Margaret make breakfast with her usual calm, chatting about everyday things, and it ate at him even more. How could someone act so normally after such a serious accusation? It was as if her conscience was clear, but the image from the café told a different story. That contrast is what lit a fire inside him, the need to find answers on his own. He started quietly, observing his wife's habits, noticing every detail of her routine. He paid attention to her schedule, the clothes she wore when going out, how long she stayed away from home. He began glancing at messages she left on her phone when she forgot it on the table, finding nothing but ordinary chats with friends and family. There was nothing suspicious, no clue confirming his fears. Still, the emptiness of these findings brought no peace. Instead, it pushed Michael's mind into even darker scenarios. With each passing day, the feeling of being deceived grew. He started thinking that if Margaret really was involved with Eric, she'd never leave such obvious traces. That thought led him to a different kind of surveillance, direct observation. Michael made up excuses to come home early and check if she was around, or drove past places she usually visited just to confirm where she was. Every time, he found her doing normal things, with no hint of secrets. Still, his heart wouldn't settle. When he realized watching Margaret wasn't getting him anywhere, he decided to shift focus. If there was something to uncover, maybe it was tied to Eric. After all, he was the link in all this confusion. Michael began paying attention to his boss's movements at work, pretending disinterest while his eyes scanned every detail. He discreetly noted departure times, commitments Eric mentioned, anything that might be useful. One afternoon, after hearing Eric say he'd be leaving early, Michael decided to follow him. He kept a safe distance, careful not to be seen. The adrenaline of spying kept him on high alert. Every turn Eric's car made felt like a test of Michael's nerves. He was certain that sooner or later, he'd find something that justified the café scene. To his surprise, Eric's routine was simple: restaurants, gyms, quick meetups with coworkers. Nothing suggesting a connection with Margaret, nothing close to what Michael imagined. Still, Michael persisted. He followed Eric multiple times, on different days, and each time the result was the same: normalcy. It was as if Eric had nothing to hide. This lack of answers started to unsettle him. Michael didn't know if he should feel relieved or even more trapped. Part of him wanted to believe it was all a mistake, but another part argued that the absence of proof was proof in itself, as if both of them were hiding something perfectly. Nights grew longer, days heavier. He caught himself staring at his wife, searching for invisible signs to confirm his suspicions. On the other side, he watched Eric at work, analyzing every gesture, every glance. Michael's life was beginning to revolve around a silent investigation only he knew about. And the more he searched, the less he found. This void tormented him even more than if he'd seen something concrete. Inside him, the conviction grew that he couldn't stop. If he hadn't found anything yet, it was only because he wasn't looking the right way. With that thought, Michael began preparing to go further, ready to cross lines he'd never imagined crossing, all in pursuit of a truth that seemed to slip away with every attempt. When Eric asked Michael to come in on a Saturday morning, something inside him snapped like an alarm. It was strange. In all his years at the company, he'd rarely been asked to come in on a weekend, especially for non-urgent tasks. Michael agreed right away, but in his mind, the situation felt like a carefully laid trap. He saw this invitation as the perfect opportunity for Eric to meet Margaret without raising suspicion. It was as if all the pieces he'd been assembling finally clicked into place. The night before was torture. Michael barely slept. He kept imagining Margaret at home, free, while he'd be stuck at the office for hours. The idea that she might use this exact window to be with Eric grew in his mind like a spreading fire. When Saturday arrived, he put on his work clothes, but he carried more than tools or papers. He carried the weight of suspicion and the desperate hope that something would finally be revealed. At the office, he tried to focus on the task at hand. He went through the motions, but his mind was elsewhere. Time dragged on, each minute feeling like part of a setup. The silence of the empty building didn't help, it only amplified his own paranoia. He pictured conversations, scenes, secret meetings happening at that very moment. The tension built until it became unbearable. Suddenly, Michael dropped everything. He couldn't stand another second in that office while his personal life hung in the balance. He grabbed his keys, left without explanation, and drove straight home. On the way, his heart pounded, racing as if anticipating an unavoidable confrontation. He braced himself to catch Margaret in a scene that would finally end all doubt. With every turn, his mind painted more vivid images of what he might find. When he parked, his breathing was heavy, charged with the anxiety of someone about to uncover the most painful secret of his life. He threw open the door, ready to demand answers, ready to face a truth that could shatter the foundation of their entire marriage. But what he found was absolute silence. No voices, no movement. Just an emptiness that seemed to mock his expectations. He stepped inside, still confused, trying to make sense of why the house was so quiet. Then, in an instant, the lights flashed on and a wave of voices surrounded him. Surprise. The shock was so great that Michael froze. The room was packed with coworkers, friends, and family. Margaret stood there, glowing, next to Eric and his father, the company owner. Balloons, a decorated table, everyone clapping. It was a party in his honor. For a moment, Michael felt the ground vanish beneath him. The entire mental structure of betrayal and conspiracy collapsed in seconds. What he believed was the ultimate proof of deception was actually the perfect cover for a grand celebration. A generous check was handed to him, thank you speeches were given, all praising his dedication, his years of effort, his legacy at the company. As he received hugs and smiles, Michael was still dazed. The tension that had gripped him for weeks began to fade, but it left behind a trail of shame and disbelief. He watched Margaret interact with everyone, happy, proud, showing no hint of guilt. Eric, once the target of so many suspicions, spoke with genuine gratitude about Michael's outstanding work. And in that festive atmosphere, surrounded by applause and celebration, Michael realized he'd turned an act of kindness into a maze of suspicion. The surprise meant to be a gift had nearly become the trigger to destroy what he valued most. But one question still lingered, pulsing in his mind even amid the revelation. The party noise still echoed when Michael felt the need to clear one last thing. He greeted co-workers, thanked them for the speeches, held the check like a trophy arriving at the perfect moment, but the question remained. He approached Margaret in a quieter corner of the room and asked directly, "Was that you in the café with Eric?" She looked up with a soft smile, the same one she always used to calm things down. "Of course it was," she said. "He called to ask for help with your party, and you almost found out everything." She explained it plainly, guest list, confirmation with HR, timeline for setup, who'd bring old factory photos, who'd give the speeches, even the text for the card that would go with the check. The cafe meeting was to finalize details and set the Saturday work plan, which would serve as a cover while the team brought in sound, cake, and the plaque still wrapped on the table. Michael took a deep breath. What he'd interpreted as inappropriate closeness was actually planning. And the Saturday? She pointed to Eric, who approached, sensing the topic. The work invite was a way to keep Michael away while everyone organized the surprise. The silence he'd walked into was the final step, lights off, phones quiet, people hiding behind the couch, and the perfectly timed surprise as he entered. Simple, straightforward, complete. Michael looked at his wife as if thanking her for a risk that, in the end, paid off, and felt the weight of suspicion begin to lift. Eric asked for a moment to speak. He said this was the least they could do. He talked about Michael's impact on the company, how the toughest reports only moved forward after passing his desk, how the team's mood shifted when Michael said, "Leave it to me." Then he shared a small story that caught Michael off guard. In Eric's first month as a trainee, long before becoming manager, he'd spilled coffee on technical drawings for an urgent project. Total panic. Michael spent the rest of the day reconstructing the documents, called suppliers, redid measurements, calmed the client, and delivered everything as if nothing had happened. He never took credit. That act saved Eric's evaluation. "I promised that when I had the chance to repay you, I'd do it big," he said, getting straight to the point. "Today is that day." The room fell silent when Richard Collins, the company owner and Eric's father, raised his hand for quiet. His voice was steady. He thanked everyone for coming, took a breath, and revealed what he'd saved for last. The check was generous, but there was more. Starting next week, the factory's training room would be renamed the Michael Turner Room. The plaque, still covered, would be installed first thing Monday morning. On top of that, they offered a light consulting contract, just a few hours a week, so Michael's experience could keep guiding younger employees without taking away his freedom as a retiree. Extended health coverage, lifetime access to the technical library, and a formal invitation to open the next apprentice training cycle. Co-workers erupted in applause. Margaret squeezed Michael's arm with pride, and he felt something shift inside, as if the honor had put every piece back in its place. The party continued with lively conversations, photos playing on a screen, him in a helmet decades ago, at a team lunch, receiving a safety award, and in the middle of it all, another small story surfaced. Hannah, now an engineer, asked to speak. She said that as an intern, she'd submitted a spreadsheet with a wrong formula during a critical closing. Instead of calling her out in the hallway, Michael took her into his office, calmly explained the error, redid the calculation with her, and had her send the final file with her name highlighted. "That changed my career," Hannah said. "I learned to take responsibility without fear. If I lead a team today, it's because someone taught me how to fail the right way." Michael listened in silence, realizing that the career he thought was built on routine was also made of seeds planted, people who grew because someone once gave them the right hand. When the music lowered and guests began to leave, Michael and Margaret stood side by side again. He apologized for the weight of the past weeks. He said a misread image had turned into a maze in his head, and living with that had been hard. Margaret listened calmly and responded without raising her voice. She understood his fear. Retirement carried ghosts, too much free time, the feeling of a chapter ending, the sense that life was losing its center. She knew all those anxieties and had feared that a surprise this big might make things worse if discovered at the wrong time. That's why the secrecy. That's why the café. That's why the Saturday. "Trust is also planned," she said. "Today, I planned yours." Michael looked at the check, at the still-covered plaque, at the owner's son who once was a clumsy trainee and now spoke confidently in front of the whole factory. He felt shame and relief at the same time. The thought that had haunted him for days lost its grip. The answer he'd been searching for was right there, plain for all to see, no tricks. He walked over to Richard to thank him. The older man gripped his hand tightly and shared one more story few knew. Years ago, during a serious crisis, when there was pressure to cut staff and reduce costs, it was Michael's technical report that prevented a rushed decision that would have shut down an entire production line. The report called for a precise adjustment, saved jobs, and preserved a key contract. "You saved the backbone of this company that month," Richard said. "Today, we're repaying you with a name, recognition, and peace for your next chapter." Back on the couch, Margaret pulled a thin envelope from her pocket. Inside were handwritten cards from people across different departments. Short, direct messages, some funny, some emotional. "You taught me how to organize my thoughts, you gave me the courage to present my first project, that talk after my mistake is why I stayed." Each card was a window into a moment he'd forgotten but someone else had kept like a milestone. Michael felt his eyes burn, took a deep breath, and hugged Margaret. He said that if he'd trusted sooner, he could have spared them both many rough nights. She rested her head on his shoulder and replied simply, "Life together requires conversation before assumption." Eric returned with the covered plaque, inviting Michael to pull the cloth. The polished metal revealed the clean engraving, "Michael Turner Room." Applause broke out spontaneously. No more speeches were needed, there was nothing left to explain. Instead, there was a new image settling in Michael's mind, his story becoming a home for other stories. He placed his hand on the plaque like someone closing one chapter and opening another, turned to Margaret, and with a tired half-smile, admitted he'd almost ruined his own party. She smiled softly, cupped his face in her hands, and replied with her usual short humor, the kind that always disarmed him, "Next time the surprise is for you, try surprising the surprise with trust." Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.